What's up, everybody? Hello and welcome to Not Your Average Meta, an MTG Commander channel dedicated to bringing you decks and commanders you wouldn't normally find in your average meta. This week's video is brought to you by our new channel sponsor, International MTG. If you're looking for competitive pricing on your favorite MTG cards, old and new, be sure to check out the International MTG store and TCG Player, link in the description of this video. On this week's episode of Not Your Average Meta, we have the last game we recorded a few weeks back with our friend Jacob down at the Hobby Horse in Taylorville. First up, we have Gavin playing another Theros god, but this time it's not Athreos, it's Purphoros, God of the Forge. This deck looks to generate a mass quantity of tokens in order to ping his opponents to death using his commander's ability. Next, we have Jacob playing Horobi, Death's Wail. This is a mono-black deck that looks to take advantage of Horobi's targeting ability to destroy his opponent's creatures with various forms of targeted abilities. Next, we have Justin playing his one true love, Yuriko the Tiger Shadow. This deck looks to take advantage of Yuriko's ability to flip cards off the top of his library in order to deal mass damage to all of his opponents. Lastly, we have Purphoros playing a Sidisi Brood Tyrant zombie tribal deck. This deck looks to cast Sidisi, then use her ability to create an army of zombie tokens while he self-mills himself. Now that we have our fighters, let's step into the Thunderdome and see which deck will come out on top. Turn 1, Justin draws and plays an island. Fog draws, plays a swamp, and passes. Gavin plays a Scalding Tarn, then takes one to sack it and go get a basic mountain. He then casts Norn the Wary, and in response, Justin casts Opt, scrying one and drawing a card. Jacob plays a Myriad Landscape for turn and passes. Justin draws and plays another island. He then taps one to play his Slitherblade, exiling Norn from play until end of turn. Fog plays his own island for turn and passes. Gavin draws and passes turn. Jacob draws for turn and plays a swamp. Justin draws for turn and plays a third island. Fog just draws and passes. Gavin draws and exiles Annex in order to cast a Chrome Ox, which then exiles Norn until end of turn. Jacob plays another swamp for turn, then taps through to cast a Morph creature face down, exiling Norn until end of turn. Justin draws and plays another island for turn and passes. Fog draws, then taps through for Apprentice Necromancer, exiling Norn until end of turn. Gavin draws, then taps through to cast an Iron Mirror, exiling Norn until end of turn. Jacob draws for turn, then plays an original Urborg. Justin plays another island for turn, making it apparent he needs a swamp to cast anything in his hand. Fog draws and plays an Evolving Wilds, cracking it to go get a forest. Gavin draws and plays a tapped Valakut for turn, then taps 3 for Jessica's Will, which exiles Norn. Jessica's Will then gets countered by Justin with a Supreme Will, and at the end of his turn, Jacob cracks his landscape to go get 2 swamps. Jacob draws for turn and plays a swamp. He then casts Ogre Slumlord, exiling Norn until end of turn. Justin draws, doesn't get a swamp, and passes. Fog plays another forest for turn, then finally taps 4 to cast his commander Sidisi, exiling Norn. He then mills 3 cards as she enters. He hits 1 creature and creates 1 zombie token. Gavin draws and also taps 4 to cast his commander Purphoros, exiling Norn until end of turn. He then passes and Norn returns, dealing 2 damage to each of his opponents. Jacob draws for turn and plays another swamp before tapping 4 to cast his commander Horobi, exiling Norn. He then taps another 3 to cast Belby's Armor. Norn then returns and deals 2 damage to each of Gavin's opponents. Justin draws and plays a 6 island for turn. Fog draws and plays a swamp for turn. He then goes to combat swinging Sidisi at Jacob, who responds by targeting Sidisi with Belby's Armor to kill her with Horobi's ability. On attack, Fog mills 3 more cards, hits another creature, and gets another zombie token. Sidisi then dies. Fog then taps 1 for Caustic Caterpillar, exiling Norn. He then taps 2 to sack it and destroy Belby's Armor. He then passes and Norn comes back into play, dealing 2 damage to each of Gavin's opponents. Gavin draws, then pays 4 for Krinko Mob Boss, exiling Norn. Norn then comes back into play, dealing 2 damage to each of Gavin's opponents. Jacob draws and plays a swamp for turn. He then taps 3 to cast Mimic Fat, exiling Norn. He then taps another 5 to cast Sir Conrad, which gets countered by Fog with an Arcane Denial. Jacob then goes to combat, swinging Horobi at Gavin for 4 commander damage. Norn then comes back into play, dealing 2 damage to each of Gavin's opponents. Justin draws, then taps through to evoke Muldrifter, exiling Norn. He then draws 2 cards and plays a Bad River for turn. Norn then comes back into play, dealing 2 damage to each of Gavin's opponents. Fog draws and plays an island for turn. He then taps 3 for an Eternal Witness, exiling Norn. He then gets back his Sorin from his graveyard before casting it. Fog then pays 3 for Crow of Dark Tidings, milling 2 more cards. Norn then comes back into play, dealing 2 damage to each of Gavin's opponents. Gavin draws and plays Goblin Instigator, exiling Norn, and getting a Goblin token. He then deals 4 damage to each of his opponents. Gavin then taps Krinko to create 3 Goblin tokens. In response, Fog taps 1 and pays 4 life to dismember Krinko. Krinko then dies, and Gavin gets 2 Goblins, dealing 4 more damage to his opponents. Norn then comes back into play, dealing 2 more damage to each of his opponents. Jacob draws and plays a Rogue's Passage. He then uses the passage to target Norn, finally killing him. He then pays enough to make a copy of Muldrifter that he exiled with Mimic Vet, drawing 2 cards as he enters. Jacob then goes to combat, swinging Horobi and the Muldrifter Gavin for 6 damage. Justin draws, plays another island, then cracks the Bad River to finally get a swamp. Justin swings Slitherblade at Gavin, then jet swinging Yuriko from the command zone. He then reveals a Throat Slitter off the top of his library, dealing 6 damage to each of his opponents. Justin then recasts Slitherblade and Phantom Ninja. Fog draws for turn, then recasts Sidisi, milling 3 cards, hitting a creature, and getting a zombie token. He then sacks his Necromancer to bring back his Mire Triton, gaining 2 life and milling 2 cards. He then goes to combat and swings all of his available creatures at Gavin. In response, Jacob targets the Iron Mirth Urborg, killing him. Gavin then takes his 11 damage. Gavin starts his turn playing Wooded Foothills before paying 1 and cracking it to go get a mountain. He then casts Chandra, Acolyte of Flame, and uses her ability to create 2 elementals, dealing 4 damage to each of his opponents. Jacob plays a Swamp for turn that taps 4 for Infernal Darkness, turning all the lands into swamps. He then plays Thorn of the Black Rose to become the Monarch. Jacob then goes to combat and swings Horobi at Chandra, taking her out, and draws a card off the Monarch. Justin draws for turn to cast Sensei's Divining Top. He then pays 1 to look at the top 3 cards of his library and rearrange them. He then goes to combat and swings his ninjas at Gavin before ninjutsuing in Throat Slitter. After dealing damage, he destroys Gavin's Goblin Instigator and flips his top card, revealing Silent Blade Uni, dealing 7 damage to each opponent, taking out Fog and Jacob. Gavin draws and plays Valakut's Awakening for turn, which gets countered by Justin with a counterspell. Justin draws for turn, then taps 1 to use his top. He looks at his top 3 cards and then goes to combat, swinging out at Gavin for the win. The big winner of today's game is Justin playing his trusty Yuriko deck. It definitely seems like Justin's lack of swamps was keeping him from winning this game early, but when he finally got there, he got the W. The MVP of today's game was Justin's Bad River that allowed him to finally get a swamp and enable his deck's game plan, without which he probably would have lost. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe so you can see more games and decks you wouldn't normally see in your average meta.